From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Tonight, in this time, in this place, you helped bend that moral arc a little closer to that justice, and you did it. That moral arc, not only was it bent more, not only was its aim truer, but you sent it right through the heart of the great state of Alabama in doing so.
No more. A stunning upset in Alabama as Democrat Doug Jones defeats Republican Roy Moore in the race to fill the Senate seat left vacant by Attorney General Jeff Sessions, marking the first time in a quarter century a Democrat has won a U.S. Senate race in the state. 96% of African-American voters voted for Jones, with a staggering 98% of all black women voting for Jones. Nearly 70% of white voters voted for Roy Moore. Then, will the Trump administration's FCC kill net neutrality?
If the FCC gets their way, they will have more control over the internet. It will cost everyone more, and the only one who benefits will be big business. And once again, the Trump administration is helping the top 1% and the corporations and hurting everybody else.
Protests continue as the FCC plans to vote December 14th to roll back rules that make internet service providers treat web content equally. Then to a major education victory in Philadelphia, where parents, teachers, and activists mounted a campaign to reclaim control of their local public school system.
I'm officially calling on the members of the School Reform Commission to vote to dissolve at their next scheduled meeting.
We'll go to Pennsylvania to speak with Philadelphia Council member Helen Gim, who helped lead the fight to take back the city's schools, and with a parent from the Our City, Our Schools coalition. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Alabama, where in a stunning upset, Democrat Doug Jones defeated Republican Roy Moore in the controversial race to fill the Alabama Senate seat left vacant by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. With 100% of the vote tallied, Jones led Moore by nearly 21,000 votes, a margin of 1.5%. Jones addressed supporters in a victory speech Tuesday night.
At the end of the day, this entire race has been about dignity and respect. This campaign has been about the rule of law. This campaign has been about common courtesy and decency and making sure everyone in this state, regardless of which zip code you live in, is going to get a fair shake in life.
Doug Jones' victory marks the first time in 25 years a Democrat has won a U.S. Senate race in Alabama. Tuesday's special election was highly controversial, pitting Doug Jones against Roy Moore, an accused pedophile with a long history of racism, sexism, homophobia, and Islamophobia. Roy Moore has so far refused to concede the race and on Tuesday night called for a recount. But President Donald Trump, who'd repeatedly endorsed Roy Moore, did acknowledge Moore's defeat, tweeting, "Congratulations to Doug Jones on a hard-fought victory. The write-in votes played a very big factor, but a win is a win. The people of Alabama are great, and the Republicans will have another shot at this seat in a very short period of time. It never ends," Trump tweeted. Tuesday's vote was highly divided by race and gender, with African-American voters, particularly women, largely responsible for defeating Roy Moore. Overall, 96% of African-American voters voted for Doug Jones, with a staggering 98% of all black women voting for Jones. In contrast, nearly 70% of white voters voted for Roy Moore. A full 63% of white women voted for Moore, despite Moore being accused by multiple women of sexually harassing or assaulting them when they were teenagers, one as young as 14. Democrats Democratic strategist Simone Sanders, who served as Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders' press secretary during his presidential campaign, said, quote, Doug Jones would not have won today without the turnout we saw from African-American voters. Black women have been absolutely clear in their support for Democratic policies and Democratic candidates. It's high time for Democrats to invest in that effort, she said. Doug Jones' victory means the Republicans' majority in the Senate will narrow to 51-49. We'll have more on the Alabama special election after headlines. New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand has fired back at President Trump after he used sexist language to attack her on Twitter. The feud began when Senator Gillibrand became the 5th senator to call for President Trump's resignation over multiple accusations of sexual harassment and assault against him. In response, Trump attacked Gillibrand, the only female senator of the 5, tweeting, quote, lightweight Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a total flunky for Chuck Schumer, and someone who would come to my office begging for campaign contributions not so long ago and would do anything for them, is now in the ring fighting against Trump, very disloyal to Bill and crooked, used, unquote. On Tuesday, Gillibrand fired back, saying Trump's attack was sexist.
It was a sexist smear attempting to silence my voice. And I will not be silenced on this issue. Neither will the women who stood up to the president yesterday, and neither will the millions of women who have been marching since the Women's March to stand up against policies they do not agree with.
President Trump has signed a massive $700 billion military spending bill, by far the largest military budget in the world. The spending bill won't go into effect, however, unless Congress rolls back 2011 legislation that caps federal spending, including by the military. This is President Trump speaking Tuesday.
Finally, the defense bill authorizes major investments in our military's greatest weapon of all, its warriors. The NDAA increases the size of the American Armed Forces for the first time in 7 years, and it provides our military service members with their largest pay increase in 8 years. Now Congress must finish the job by eliminating the defense sequester and passing a clean appropriations bill. I think it's going to happen. We need our military. It's got to be perfecto.
According to the National Priorities Project, U.S. military expenditures are roughly the size of the world's next 7 largest military budgets combined. Palestinians are continuing to protest President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and to move the U.S. embassy there. On Tuesday, Palestinian protesters in Ramallah were injured by Israeli soldiers who attacked the protesters with tear gas. Meanwhile, an image has gone viral of a beaten and blindfolded young Palestinian protester being arrested by a dozen heavily armed Israeli soldiers. The 16-year-old boy, Fauzi al-Junaidi, is slated to appear in front of an Israeli military court today on charges of throwing stones. Israeli soldiers have killed at least 4 Palestinian protesters and wounded about 700 since President Trump's announcement. This is the mayor of the Democratic Arab Party, Talib al-Sana, speaking Tuesday at a protest in front of the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv.
We are here in the front of Israeli United States Embassy to say that the Trump declaration that Jerusalem belongs for Israel unacceptable. This is make obstacles in the peace process, and he have no right to declare that Jerusalem belongs to Israel. Jerusalem is an issue for negotiation between Palestinian and Israel.
In Ethiopia, there are reports the government has blocked access to Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms in the wake of a military crackdown against protests in the Oromia region. Oromo authorities and local news reports say between 6 and 15 people were killed by Ethiopian security forces on Monday in the Oromia region, and that a dozen more were injured. Since 2015, the Oromo people have been staging widespread anti-government protests, which began as resistance to the government's plan to privatize a forest, but have since grown into a nationwide campaign against human rights abuses by the Ethiopian government. In the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte has won congressional approval to extend martial law in the southern Mindanao region until the end of 2018. Duterte claims the martial law is necessary to fight against militants aligned with ISIS. Human rights activists are concerned Duterte may try to extend martial law nationwide as part of his increasingly authoritarian and bloody presidency. Protests continue over the Federal Communications Commission plan to dismantle landmark regulations that ensure equal access to the Internet. The FCC is slated to vote on the measure on Thursday, December 14th. The measure would roll back net neutrality rules requiring Internet service providers to treat web content equally. On Monday, more than 20 pioneers of the Internet, including World Wide Web inventor Tim Berners-Lee, published an open letter that slammed FCC Chairman Ajit Pai's proposal. The open letter, entitled "You Don't Understand How the Internet Works," calls on the FCC to keep the Internet open. We'll have more on the FCC vote later in the broadcast. Thousands of protesters took to the streets Tuesday in Buenos Aires, Argentina, to protest the meeting of the World Trade Organization, or WTO. This is a member of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, Nora Cartinas.
We don't want the World Trade Organization. We don't want to lose our sovereignty. We want to be a free people with our own determination. We don't want neither policies of hunger nor unemployment, nor the handing over of sovereignty to be imposed on us.
In France, dozens of world leaders met Tuesday for the one-day climate change conference held on the second anniversary of the signing of the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Accord. Ahead of the meeting, French President Emmanuel Macron said President Trump was not invited as a result of his move to pull the U.S. out of the Paris deal. At the meeting, the World Bank announced it will no longer finance upstream oil and gas after 2019. Environmental groups heralded the announcement, with the group Oil Change International saying, quote, "It's hard to overstate the significance of this historic announcement by the World Bank." And in Michigan, residents are demanding answers after police in Grand Rapids handcuffed and detained an 11-year-old African-American girl at gunpoint last week. The interaction began after the police arrived at the girl's home, where they were searching for her 42-year-old aunt, who is white. But when they did not find the 42-year-old white woman, they instead handcuffed and detained the 11-year-old black girl, fifth grader Honesty Hodges, as well as her mother and another relative, both of whom are also black. Honesty Hodges' mother says her daughter was traumatized by the interaction. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Alabama, where in a stunning upset, Democrat Doug Jones defeated Republican Roy Moore in the controversial race to fill the Alabama Senate seat left vacant by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. With 100% of the vote tallied, Jones led Moore by nearly 21,000 votes, a margin of 1.5 percentage points. With Jones in the Senate, the Republicans' majority will narrow to 51-49, endangering Trump's agenda and possibly ushering in a Democratic wave in next year's congressional elections. Jones addressed supporters in a victory speech Tuesday night.
I am truly overwhelmed. I am truly, truly overwhelmed. But you know, folks, and you have all heard me say this at one point or another in this campaign, I have always believed that the people of Alabama had more in common than to divide us. We have shown not just around the state of Alabama, but we have shown the country the way that we can be unified. I've said it before. Alabama has been at a crossroads. We have been at crossroads in the past, and unfortunately, we have usually taken the wrong fork. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, you took the right road.
Doug Jones' victory marks the first time in 25 years that a Democrat has won a U.S. Senate race in Alabama. Tuesday's special election was highly controversial, pitting Doug Jones against Roy Moore, an accused pedophile with a long history of racism, sexism, homophobia, and Islamophobia. Roy Moore has so far refused to concede the race, and on Tuesday night called for a recount. But President Donald Trump, who had repeatedly endorsed Moore, did acknowledge his defeat, tweeting, quote, "Congratulations to Doug Jones on a hard-fought victory. The write-in votes played a very big factor, but a win is a win. The people of Alabama are great, and the Republicans will have another shot at this seat in a very short period of time. It never ends," unquote.
Tuesday's vote was highly divided by race and gender, with African-American voters, particularly women, largely responsible for defeating Roy Moore. Overall, 96% of African-American voters voted for Doug Jones, with a staggering 98% of all black women voting for Jones. In contrast, nearly 70% of white voters voted for Roy Moore. A full 63% of white women voted for Moore, despite Moore being accused by multiple women of sexually harassing or assaulting them when they were teenagers, one as young as 14. Democratic strategist Simone Sanders, who served as Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders' press secretary during his presidential campaign, said, quote, "Doug Jones would not have won today without the turnout we saw from African-American voters. Black women have been absolutely clear in their support for Democratic policies and Democratic candidates. It's high time for Democrats to invest in that effort," unquote. This is Roy Moore speaking Tuesday night, telling supporters in Montgomery that votes were still coming in and state law would trigger a recount if the margin was within 0.5%.
Realize when the vote is this close that it's not over. And we've still got to go by the rules about this recount provision. And the Secretary of State has explained it to us, and we're expecting that the press will go up there and talk to them to find out what the situation is. But we also know that God is always in control. You know, part of the problem with this campaign is we've been painted in an unfavorable and unfaithful light. We've been put in a hole, if you will, and it reminds me of a passage in Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. And that's what we've got to do, is wait on God and let this process play out.
Meanwhile, Alabama Secretary of State John Merrill says the votes from Tuesday's election will be certified between December 26 and January 3rd. Doug Jones' victory means the Republicans' majority in the Senate will narrow to 51 to 49. For more, we're joined by Pema Levy, political reporter for Mother Jones, who's been following voter turnout and voter suppression in the race closely. Her latest articles headline, "Doug Jones rides a perfect GOP storm to the Senate." Welcome to Democracy Now!, Pema. Start off with your response to what happened yesterday and the staggering vote of African Americans, particularly African American women.
Yeah, I mean, what happened last night is a really big deal. I think it shocked the entire country when Doug Jones pulled this off, and absolutely could not have been done without the support of African-American voters. I think there was a lot of worry leading up to yesterday that those voters would not turn out. Even leaders in the African-American community that I spoke with were worried that they would not be there. But I think what we're seeing is that this is a wave, and, you know, African-American voters are part of that wave, and they're, for Democrats, a critical part of that wave. And like you said, women especially, you know, women vote more than men across the board. And so absolutely, African-American women are going to be an absolutely important factor when it comes to Democratic victories, especially close ones like we had last night in Alabama.
And Pema, could you talk about the impact also of the write-in vote? Because obviously this represented those Republicans who, despite Donald Trump's entreaties, could not get themselves to vote for Roy Moore?
Yeah, I think the write-in vote is pretty interesting. Right now, it looks like the write-in vote is slightly larger than the margin between Jones and Moore. Ultimately, I'm not sure that it will make the difference, because I think that It just so happens that a lot of people, when they write in a name, they actually write in a candidate. So I think a certain number of those write-in votes will actually be votes for Doug Jones or Roy Moore. I think the bigger impact here was folks that probably didn't want to vote for Moore, and instead of writing someone in, they just stayed home. I think what really killed Moore in this election is that his base just did not turn out the way that the Democratic base turned out for Jones.
I want to go to another clip of Doug Jones' victory speech Tuesday night after this surprise upset against Roy Moore.
As Dr. King liked to quote, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, tonight in this time, in this place, you helped bend that moral arc a little closer to that justice, and you did it. That moral arc, not only was it bent more, not only was its aim truer, but you sent it right through the heart of the great state of Alabama in doing so.
So that's Doug Jones significantly quoting Dr. Martin Luther King. Explain Doug Jones' history as a prosecutor prosecuting Ku Klux Klan members who were involved with the bombing of the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. Of course, the prosecution happened much later than that.
Yes, it did. You know, when that bomb went off in 1963, the situation in Birmingham was that the police were essentially in cahoots with the KKK. And, you know, it was impossible to put on a trial and bring the bombers to justice. And so they were not tried for a long time. One of them was put away in the 70s when Alabama elected a progressive attorney general. But that person could not get the support of the FBI to go further. And so it was not until the late 90s, when Doug Jones was a federal prosecutor in Birmingham, that they were able to put this together. And Jones, you know, I've talked to people who worked with him on this case who were in his office, and they said, you know, this was a meticulous, dogged 3-year process. Jones did an incredible amount of work. It was not guaranteed. You know, you have a cold case, it's 40 years old. That is a remarkable thing to be able to pull off. And Jones, you know, by all accounts, was incredibly dedicated to bringing these people to justice and for turning a page in Alabama history. And so you, I think, see that again last night in his speech, the idea that, you know, the Alabama that he knows and loves is not the one that we think of when we read about the 1960s and we hear about the bombings, and he wants to sort of turn that page. And I think that he feels like he did that again last night. Of course, we're, you know, 13,000 votes away from Roy Moore going to the U.S. Senate. So this was a close election. On the other hand, Alabama came very close to sending Moore, you know, to Washington, but they didn't. And I think that Jones is right to say that this is a remarkable moment for his state.
And Pamela Levy, what do you think this will mean now in the Senate itself? Obviously, it's one less Republican. It's now a 51-49 margin in the Senate. How will this have an impact on the Republican Party and on Donald Trump's agenda in Washington?
Yeah, I think it'll have an effect on both, and I think that they're connected. I think, you know, on the one hand, like you just said, Republicans now have 51 votes. They have the vice president to break a tie, but they still, that means they need even more support from, you know, the more moderate folks like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. It means, you know, that they have to, they basically are not guaranteed. They've already struggled to pass tax reform. They couldn't pass their Obamacare repeal. It's going to be even harder for them. And I think the second thing is when when Republicans see what just happened in Alabama, they're going to be afraid that it can happen to them, right? If a Republican can lose in Alabama, you know, we have next year's midterms coming up, a Republican could lose almost anywhere now. And so I think the fear is, well, should I go along with this, whatever the priorities that Republicans want, because it's not popular, it's not working, I'm afraid I might lose. And so I think that, you know, the added fear of from what happened last night could also have an impact on policy in Washington.
After his victory over Roy Moore, Doug Jones emphasized the diversity of his supporters in Alabama during his victory speech on Tuesday night.
You know, I keep hearing about the different communities in this state. The African-American community, thank you. My friends in the Latino community, thank you. with this, everywhere we have gone, we have had that same energy. We've had that same excitement. At the end of the day, this entire race has been about dignity and respect. This campaign has been about the rule of law. This campaign has been about common courtesy and decency and making sure everyone in this state, regardless of which zip code you live in, is going to get a fair shake in life.
A very different speech than Roy Moore's wife gave the night before, talking about how they have black friends and that they are not anti-Semitic because one of Roy Moore's lawyers is a Jew. But the significance of this for Donald Trump, of this huge defeat, Donald Trump really pulling out all the stops to endorse Roy Moore. When you look at what this means for him, particularly around the issue of women and all of the allegations of sexual assault, misconduct, harassment against President Trump, since Roy Moore brought this issue to the fore, an accused pedophile himself, but Donald Trump not relenting, what this actually means. And even yesterday, in the midst of this special election, tweeting out this sexist comment against Senator Gillibrand.
You can absolutely look at this election last night through the lens of the Me Too movement and say that they had a huge victory. I think a lot of people were really worried going into this Senate race that Alabama would elect Roy Moore and that the message it would send to women and to victims was, it doesn't matter if you come forward, powerful men will get away with it, they'll still get elected, they'll still be in office. And, you know, because that's the message that was sent when Donald Trump won the presidency. But I think that you know, this has been an important message for victims to come forward, and if anything, it adds more momentum to this movement, and that is, of course, bad news for Donald Trump, who is, you know, the most high-profile person in this movement, who's someone who is admitted to sexual assault on tape and now has a target on his back. So I think that, you know, this is a really big deal from that perspective. It's an important moment for women's rights and for sexual harassment. And I think that this election last night ensured that women would hopefully feel safe still coming forward and feel like they're being heard.
And what about the mainstream Republican leadership, many of whom obviously were fearful of Moore being elected because they would see him as an albatross around their neck for the rest of going into the 2018 election? There's some speculation that many of them are glad he was defeated.
Yeah, I think that I would not be surprised if that were the case either. I think, you know, Cory Gardner, the head of the Senate campaign arm, said that they would never endorse Roy Moore and stayed steadfastly against him. And I think he was certainly not looking forward to a 2018 in which all of the senators up for re-election had to, you know, distance themselves from Roy Moore, but not too much. It was just going to be this awkward, horrible dance that they were all going to have to go through. They would have to answer for his comments, you know, constantly. And I think that, yeah, I think there's probably a sigh of relief going on here for a lot of people. You know, certainly it makes it harder for their priorities. Certainly it sends a really bad message for them about, you know, a wave coming against them in 2018. But at the same time, on a day-to-day basis, I think their lives just got easier.
I mean, it is astounding that 63% of white women voters voted for Roy Moore. Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, quoted, this is part of her tweet, "I hope the 9 women who accused Roy Moore feel some vindication tonight. The world heard you. We believed you. #MeToo." But 63% of white women voters in Alabama did vote for Roy Moore, but this astounding 98% of black women voters voting for Doug Jones. And also what this means as a message to the Democratic leadership when it comes to where they're going to put their resources around the country in get out the vote campaigns. It's been something that's divided the DNC for quite some time. Those who are pushing for on-the-ground operations to reach the grassroots, saying that they're not doing enough to do that. But this certainly is a vindication of that approach, Pema.
Yes, absolutely. I think that, particularly in the South, but really all over the country, you see Democratic candidates, when they run in Republican territory, they really focus on peeling off those, conservative voters that they think they can bring over to support them. And they do that at the cost of trying to really fire up the base and really reaching out to the African-American community saying, not just I'm not the other guy, but here's what I'm going to do for you. And I think that, African-American voters don't want to be taken for granted. They want to know that they want you to know that they're a critical part of their base, and therefore you need to do things that they need. For them, education is a really big deal. Healthcare is a really big deal. Criminal justice is a very big deal. And so I do absolutely think that Democrats would benefit from talking more directly to those constituencies about those issues and firing them up because, as Doug Jones said, absolutely, the Democratic Party is a party of coalitions. It's a party of lots of different groups of people coming together. The Republican Party is much more monolithic, and that's by design. They have decided to double down on white voters, and it has worked for them. They, as you said, have a majority of white voters. They had 63% of white women last night. And so, absolutely, Democrats, I think at some point, will probably realize that it's in their best interest to actually focus on the voters they have rather than spend all their resources on the voters that they might want.
Well, there was a huge turnout last night. Not huge for other countries in the world. We're talking around 40%, but it equaled or surpassed the presidential election years, even with President Obama. Quite amazing. Pema Levy, we want to thank you for being with us, political reporter for Mother Jones. Her latest article is headlined, "Doug Jones Rides a Perfect GOP Storm to the Senate." This is Democracy Now! When we come back, tomorrow, Thursday, December 14th, is the deadline for a vote in the FCC. Will they try to end net neutrality? That's our next topic. Stay with us.
Excitable boy, they all said. And he dropped the pot roast all over his chest. Excitable boy, they all said. Well, he's just an excitable boy. He took in the 4 a.m. show at the Clark. Excitable boy, they all said. And he bit the usherette's leg in the dark. Excitable boy, they all said. Well, he's just an excitable boy. Ooh, wow. Excitable boy. Ooh, wow. Excitable boy. He took little Susie to the junior prom.
Excitable Boy by Warren Zevon here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Net neutrality equals digital civil rights. That was the message projected last night onto the offices of the Federal Communications Commission, offices in one of the many protests to take place this week ahead of Thursday's vote by the FCC on whether to repeal the landmark net neutrality protections passed under President Obama in 2015. Net neutrality is the principle that Internet service providers must treat web content equally and do not block or prioritize some content over others in return for payment. The move could allow Internet service providers to cut speeds and jack up prices and drew a record 22 million comments to the FCC, which critics say the agency has not fully reviewed.
FCC Chairman Ajit Pai titled his proposal to repeal net neutrality the Restoring Internet Freedom Order, but on Monday, more than 20 pioneers of the Internet, including World Wide Web inventor Tim Berners-Lee, published an open letter that slammed Pai's proposal, titled, "You Don't Understand How the Internet Works." The letter reads, quote, "The FCC's rushed and technically incorrect proposed order to abolish net neutrality protections without any replacement is an imminent threat to the Internet we work so hard to create," unquote. The letter ends by calling on the FCC to cancel its planned vote. Just last week, 28 senators called for a delay on the vote to repeal net neutrality rules next week, citing concerns raised by a New York Attorney General investigation that found tens of thousands of New York residents may have been impersonated by fake commenters during the FCC's comment period on the rule change. The vote again is slated for Thursday, December 14th. For more, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by Joseph Torres, Senior Advisor for Government and External Affairs for Free Press, the National Media Reform Organization, former Deputy Director of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Joe. Talk about the significance of what this scheduled vote will do on Thursday.
Well, the FCC on Thursday is going to overturn the 2015 net neutrality rules that so many of us worked so hard to get passed. Those rules prevented ISPs, internet service providers like Comcast and AT&T, as you mentioned in your intro, from blocking websites, for creating a pay-for-play system where if I want to go online and watch Democracy Now! And Democracy Now! May have to pay an ISP more in order for their site to be seen at the fastest speeds by the public. These rules were put in place to prevent discrimination by ISPs, and if you're a Comcast and you own NBC, you have every incentive in the world to favor your own content and to block competition. As a person of color, as people who are voices are often marginalized, we have used the open internet in order to tell our own stories. And what this is going to do is put the gatekeeper, it's going to make these ISPs the gatekeeper to the internet. These companies provide us access to the internet, and what they are going to do is, basically have a pay-for-play system, and it's going to harm the voices of everyday people.
And Joe, can you talk about how, let's say, other countries or other areas of the world, like the European Union, have dealt with the issue of net neutrality, and specifically the growth of something called zero rating, which is sort of like when as I understand it, when the ISP providers bundle a particular app as part of so you don't have to pay extra for digital usage for particular apps, so they favor some apps over others.
Right. So what ISPs are going to do, what's really dangerous about what's about to happen, the obvious blatant discrimination, the blatant favoring of certain websites over others, some sites in the fast lanes, some sites in the slow lanes. But we're going to see all sorts of schemes, service schemes, that these companies are going to come up with that are going to be very technical, but there are ways to favor certain content over another. So let's say HBO can pay Comcast, let's say, or AT&T to say anyone who's using my content on the HBO content on the phone, if you access the content through your cell phone, it won't count against your data caps. And so HBO can afford to do that, or bigger companies, Netflix or whatever, can afford to do that. But what about Democracy Now! or other websites or other media services or content companies? They won't be able to pay to ensure that that the customers can access their site without counting against their data caps. So this is a way to incentivize certain content over others. And so zero rating is what that's called. But we're going to see all sorts of different schemes that these companies are thinking of that sound like it's good for consumers. It's a benefit, but it really isn't. It's not a benefit to democratizing people's voices online. It's definitely preferential treatment of certain content over others. With this, for instance, after this vote happens, you may see the tiering of the internet, where you have different service packages. If you want certain websites, you pay this amount. If you want your sports channels or contact to be able to access ESPN and other sites, you have to pay this amount of money. Where you be able to have fast access to those sites. But what about the content in those sites of everyday people who don't have those deep pockets to ensure that their voices could be heard? what net neutrality has done to make sure that all content is created equal. It is how the internet has been founded and it has developed. It's always been the guiding principle of the internet to ensure free speech. These companies what Chairman Pai tomorrow is going to allow these companies to discriminate at will. It can even block websites if they want to. What Chairman Pai is about to do is going to legally allow that to happen.
And Joe, assuming that this vote, because there is a 3-2 Republican majority on the FCC, is most likely to go forward, what is the recourse for those who want to stop implementation of this? Are there any possibilities in Congress or through the courts?
I'll start with the courts. We've won in court several times. The courts agreed with us in 2015 of the 2015 rules. They decided that last year. The courts have been very clear that if you want to pass net neutrality rules according to the Communications Act, you have to treat these ISPs as common carriers. And when that means that they are now, if you have common carrier rules, then these companies, ISPs, cannot discriminate online. With this, so the court has been clear about this, and we believe it is so weak, this order that the chairman is about, the legal rationale. You just can't change up regulations that the courts approved last year. So we believe that the order is so weak, so poorly written, that we have a really good chance of overturning it once again in court. In Congress, we're gonna try to work with the Congress to overturn these rules, a resolution of disapproval of these rules. We have seen in recent days more Republicans actually beginning to raise concerns. Representative Kaufman out of Colorado actually came out against these rules yesterday. Senator Snowe has voiced concern about these rules. There's other Republicans who are beginning to express concerns, and that's because of the massive amount of calls they are receiving on this issue from their constituents. We've heard from members of Congress that they're getting more calls on net neutrality than they are on the tax bill. That shows you how this has really struck a nerve and how everyday people really fundamentally understand what's at stake here. So while we're upset about what's about to happen tomorrow, we're really heartened and energized by the energy that's out there, and just the awareness of this issue has grown in through the years that we've been fighting this issue. And so we're going to continue to fight, and we feel like we have a good shot in court. And we're going to try to work with Congress to overturn these rules.
Joe, before we go, I wanted to talk about Ajit Pai's background and this remarkable moment, a joke made by the FCC chair, Ajit Pai, when he was the featured speaker last week at the Federal Communications Bar Association's annual dinner. In response to accusations that he's a corporate shill for the telecommunications industry, Pai is a former Verizon lawyer, Pai played what he jokingly called a, quote, leaked 14-year-old video that was actually a recorded skit supposedly set in 2003 in Verizon's D.C. office, where Pai worked as an attorney before joining the FCC. In the video, a Verizon executive tells Pai the FCC is captured by the industry, but, quote, not captured enough. So we have a plan. What plan, Pai asks? The executive responds, we want to brainwash and groom a Verizon puppet to install as FCC chair. Think Manchurian candidate, to which Pai replies, that sounds awesome. This is a clip, supposedly, of the leaked video. Listen closely.
As you know, the FCC is captured by industry, but we think it's not captured enough. We want to brainwash and groom a Verizon puppet to install this FCC. That sounds awesome. I know, right?
Again, this was played just like in the last few weeks. The Verizon executive in the skit with FCC Chairman Pai is Verizon's Senior Vice President and Deputy General Counsel, Kathy Grillo. Joe Torres, if you can talk about the significance of this. Again, Ajit Pai, the FCC chair, former Verizon attorney.
Well, when that was happening, we were out there on the streets in front of the Washington Hilton, which I believe is the same place to hold the Washington Correspondents' Dinner each year with the president. And it's this Washington insider thing where the lobbyists come together and they tell jokes. The head of the FCC each year gives a roast of himself. And to me, he was just telling the truth of who he is. it was plain and clear. Like, it wasn't even fun. I mean, it's supposed to be funny, but to me, he was just being honest about who he is and his intention. He has stated from the beginning of this process that he plans to win this battle. He made that comment at an event at FreedomWorks early in April. He's being totally intentional what he's doing, and I think he was only speaking. He was only telling the truth about himself. It wasn't even funny. But this tells you, like, that scene. It tells you everything you need to know. You hear all those lobbyists inside there laughing. Folks are on the street protesting. That very day he spoke, there were over 700 protests of Verizon stores across the country. Thousands of people showed up, hundreds in New York, hundreds in Boston, hundreds in Seattle. And we're going to continue to protest. We're protesting tomorrow outside the FCC, 9 to 11 o'clock. We're making sure the voices of people of color are being heard. And for me, what's really troubling here is the first Indian-American FCC chairman, and he really doesn't care about the impact of net neutrality and other issues he's overseeing on communities of color. And so we're going to make sure our voices are heard because our communities are the most impacted by this. And so, yeah, that is, you've covered before the Washington Correspondents' Dinner and how grotesque it is. And this is, net neutrality in the open internet. We're talking about the future of media here and who has access and control and whose voices are valued, whose stories are told, whose stories are dehumanized.
Joe, we're going to have to leave it there, but I thank you so much for being with us, and we'll continue to cover this, of course. Joseph Torres, Senior Advisor for Government External Affairs for Free Press, the National Media Reform Organization. When we come back, a major victory for parents and community control of public schools in Philadelphia. Stay with us.
Here comes the 8th, like a clockwork with no relation to the girls I roll around with, a lunar modulation that brings me to my knees, drives me to a distraction. I can no sooner part with than relief.
Modulation by the classic Brown from the album Rock the Nation, Musicians for Network Neutrality. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We're in today by looking at a major education victory in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where parents, teachers, and activists mounted a successful campaign to reclaim control of their local public school system. Last summer, organizers decided to challenge the School Reform Commission, a 5-person state-backed body implemented in 2001 by then Pennsylvania Governor Mark Schweiker after he declared the city's education system financially distressed. Under the commission, dozens of Philadelphia public schools closed, and the city saw a spike in charter schools. Community groups responded by forming a coalition called Our City, Our Schools to pressure Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf and Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney to return control over the school district to local voters. Last month, Philadelphia Mayor Kenney heeded the organizers' demands and called for the dissolution of the commission. This is Kenney addressing the Philadelphia City Council.
If we do not have quality schools in every neighborhood, the people who have helped to reverse the city's decades of population loss will not stay. The children whose families cannot afford to leave will be unprepared to compete in the 21st century economy. Businesses will not come to Philadelphia, and those that are here won't have the local talent pool to grow. The city's poverty and crime rates will remain stagnant or they will worsen. So today, after nearly 2 years of careful consideration and research, 98 school visits, and conversations with 158 principals and countless parents, teachers, and business leaders, I'm officially calling on the members of the School Reform Commission to vote to dissolve at their next scheduled meeting.
So at the end of the School Reform Commission, Philadelphia School District returns to city control after 16 years of state management. For more, we go to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where we're joined by 2 guests, Helen Gim, longtime community activist, now Philadelphia City Council member, who helped lead the fight to take back the schools, and Kendra Brooks, part of the Our City, Our Schools coalition, as well as Parents United, has been organizing in her North Philadelphia neighborhood for a decade. She's the parent of 2 children who attend Philadelphia district schools. Let's begin with City Council member Helen Gim. Talk about why you got involved with this struggle and its national significance now that Philadelphia public schools are back in the hands of Philadelphians.
Sure. First of all, good morning, Amy and Juan. It's really great to join you here. And this is a really great moment for Philadelphia and for education observers all across the country. 16 years ago, the city of Philadelphia was probably the largest city to be taken over by the state of Pennsylvania at the time. It was sold to us as a massive effort to privatize whole chunks of the city school system, to turn it over to one for-profit entity in particular, Edison Schools Incorporated, which no longer exists, as a school manager, and to become what would eventually be a 16-year experiment on Black, brown, and immigrant children that was not guided by education research, that included things like high-stakes testing, mass school closings, reckless charter expansion, and the like. And in response, over the 16 years, the thing that became the most encouraging aspect of Philadelphia's fight back was that all of us pulled together. Parents in particular. I was a new mom at the time and was sending a child into kindergarten, became very active. I was a former public school teacher, and we were very active. Community members came together, educators, parents came together to push back against an agenda that was not fundamentally centering the needs of young people, that was promoting ideas that were not backed by research and were hurting far too many children, especially children of color in Philadelphia, and that we needed to chart a different path. And the way to do that was to form a broad-based coalition amongst folks and to use all of our resources to invest in one another and to invest into a big fight. And that was mirrored nationally. And 16 years later, we stand together and we watch the state takeover go down. And we will build a new people representative school board out of it. And we'll keep fighting.
And Kendra Brooks, would you talk about what this state control has meant to the public schools, your direct experience with your children over the failure of state management of your schools?
I think for me, once again, thank you for this opportunity. Through this process, earlier they mentioned that I have 2 children that are currently in public school, but I have 4 children. My oldest is actually 27 and my youngest is 9. So I've been through this process from the beginning, educating children in this public school system and understanding what this takeover meant. When we begin to see the loss of resources, the loss of teachers, the increase of class sizes. Our local public school went from a K-5 to a K-8, and we still lost 27 teachers. Those are the things that directly affected me and my community when I think about what this state takeover meant to schools here in Philadelphia. At the time, I was only concerned about my public school, when it was relevant to me and my children. But as I began asking around and connecting with organizations and began doing more advocacy work, I realized that it was affecting schools throughout North and Northwest Philadelphia and throughout the city as well. And it wasn't beneficial. So a part of it was that the state was supposed to come help turn around the financial situation of the school, and we still continue to see schools starving of resources, teachers, nurses, building conditions are poor, resources for children with special needs, resources to help immigrant families. All those things continue to be depleted under this state takeover. So I don't understand what the purpose of the experiment was when it really didn't work. It really didn't benefit the children in Philadelphia at all in any kind of way.
And how were you able to build a grassroots movement that eventually pressured the mayor and the state to return to local control?
As you begin to talk to families and communities, like going to school communities, talking to parents in the schoolyard, begin talking about the loss in education from what their experience was in education to their children's experience in education, and start sharing facts about actually what's happening in schools around the city and allowing parents to understand it's not just your school, that this is a citywide effort and we all need to get involved. People were willing to stand up and fight for their schools, for other schools, for schools in their communities, and connect with other parents around the city to make sure that we have a quality education system for all kids, because we should be able to move around the city, and you shouldn't go. Every neighborhood school should be a quality neighborhood school. And I think once we begin having that conversation with parents and really showing them what's missing, I think a lot of times parents not inside the building and realize that it wasn't a nurse or that there wasn't a counselor until you need it. So if you don't need it, you don't know it's not there. So once we start saying that this is happening district-wide, like all schools are suffering, and we need you to join in the fight, a lot of parents was like, I'm willing.
Helen Gim, this is a big day after election. That's Alabama election. But there were major significant results out of November election, Larry Krasner becoming the district attorney. Now, I was wondering if you can talk. You were just recently at an event speaking about education, not incarceration, how this take-back of the Philadelphia schools fits into this picture.
You know, one of the best things about the pushback around the public education, you know, the state takeover of public education, the privatization of public education, is that eventually over a period of time, because so many of us were coming together from different places, we were unifying around a broad-based movement around our public schools, we were really talking about our children, our neighborhoods, our families, and the city. So it became much bigger than an education fight. It actually became very much a unifying force that pulled together grassroots activists that were involved with youth justice work, that had been involved with the criminal justice system, that were looking at questions about politics and integrity, that were educators, of course, but were fundamentally engaged with a lot of deep-rooted issues in our city, including immigrants, sanctuary cities, the fight for, you know, the pushback against cutting you know, efforts at anti-poverty programs. So all of these forces came together and became this really broad-based movement. In particular, the education movement and the criminal justice movement so closely aligned together because so many of our young people are involved in dysfunctional systems. So we've got 1 out of 5 high school students who are either involved in the criminal justice or DHS, our Department of Human Services. And that requires us to think very differently. So when we're talking about our public schools, and if people come in and give us solutions that only talk about increasing test scores or cutting away extraneous services like counselors and nurses or after-school programs or support services because they're not focused in on the basics that would allow them to better pass, you know, a test score that's crafted out of Princeton Review or out of K-12 or one of these other types of multinational companies, then parents are going to push back. We're going to talk about the realities of what our young people are living with today. We're going to talk about the reality of access to services and support services in our city that make a huge difference in changing young people's lives. So this fundamentally became much bigger than an education movement. It aligned very closely with,
Helen Gim, we just have about 30 seconds, but I wanted to ask you in terms of the impact. There's a Senate bill in Pennsylvania that would make the use of private vouchers and charters and the growth of charter schools even greater. Could you talk about that and your efforts on that?
Sure. The voucher issue has come up multiple times in Pennsylvania. It's been also defeated multiple times. But the difference that we've got right now is that the movement in Philadelphia spread across the state. The movement that took down the state takeover also took down a sitting governor. In 2014, it took on the politics of moneyed ed reformers in 2015 municipal race. And we're following closely to make it clear that education is a political issue for us. It's going to be involving Kendra, myself. This is not just an isolated political fight in Harrisburg. This is speaking directly to communities all across the state of Pennsylvania. And those legislators who want to
we have 5 seconds.
Try to pretend that, that vouchers are going to sell the day are going to find out that it's a losing battle.
We want to thank you both for being with us. Helen Gim, Philadelphia City Council member, and Kendra Brooks with Parents United in Our Cities, Our Schools. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced by Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddis, Dina Sam Alkoff. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.